The air war in Ukraine has often seen new and old technologies collide. This, for example, is a Tupolev 22M, a Cold War workhorse strategic bomber. It's arguably a triumph of Soviet engineering that once threatened NATO carrier groups during the Cold War, and is now one of the key features of Russia's missile campaign in Ukraine. And this is a Tupolev 22M on fire in its airbase deep inside Russian territory, having been struck not by an expensive Ukrainian cruise missile or shot out of the sky by air defense systems, but instead reportedly destroyed in a Ukrainian drone attack, a system that was less a triumph of engineering by a major design firm, and instead close to the work of a couple of blokes throwing something together in a shed using components they ordered off the internet. In Ukraine's war, it's a constant reality that the old and the expensive is constantly threatened by the new and the cheap, with Ukraine's few remaining Sukhoi 24s, for example, soldiering on as the only thing in their arsenal capable of deploying newly delivered French and British cruise missiles. It's a reminder that even in the drone era, manned platforms matter, which is why the recent announcement that Ukraine will finally be getting its fourth-generation fighter aircraft, the F-16, from its NATO allies was so significant, and why, after nearly 5 months, it's time to once again look at the air and missile war in Ukraine and start asking what these new developments might mean for the wider war. To do that, I'm first going to give some background on the air war, quickly updating us from April to now. Then we're going to break up the air campaign into a couple of key efforts, talking about Ukraine's Sabotage and Asymmetric campaign, the dueling Russian and Ukrainian strategic missile and drone offensives, including the potential impact of F-16s joining the Ukrainian fleet, before zooming in a bit more on battlefield or tactical aviation, before closing out by asking what might be next for the war in the air. But before we jump into it, let me first welcome back a returning sponsor. For major international news stories like Prigozhin's plane going down, you're going to see hundreds of potential headlines published by news organisations across the political spectrum. And the details of what is reported can differ, with different outlets, for example, covering Putin's speech about Prigozhin's passing, sometimes emphasising his more positive or negative statements. Stories like this one suggesting Prigozhin may have been assassinated can become blind spots, in this case covered more heavily in left-leaning outlets than right-leaning ones. Grau News is a combination website app that strives to give users a more data-driven way to consume the news, highlighting potential blind spots like that one and providing useful background information. Their My Feed feature allows you to follow specific topics in real time, or to zoom in on your own custom topic selection. I think it can be a useful tool for anyone who wants to cut through some of the noise in reporting. And if you subscribe today, you can get 30% off a Grau News Vantage plan. That then gives you access to tools like My News Bias, essentially a dashboard that lets you analyse your own news consumption and understand things like your changing habits, top sources, or whether there are potentially useful perspectives you might be missing. If you're interested, I'd really encourage you to go to ground.news/Perun or click the link in the description to get started and take advantage of a tool that is at least trying to make the media landscape just that little bit more transparent. Okay, so let's jump into it with a few quick bits of background. From previous episodes, you probably know that Russia began this war with the initiative in the air. In the opening stages, its goals seem to have been to knock out the Ukrainian Air Force, disable Ukrainian air defences, and then enable the ground force advance so that the war could be over quickly. When that failed, we saw the Russian air effort evolve. It became a much more standoff-focused effort, still doing some battlefield support at the front line, but increasingly focused on launching long-range strikes against strategic Ukrainian targets, things like the power grid. But in some ways, the Russian air effort in August 2023 has had to change, mostly to reflect the changing situation on the ground. Now, more often than not, it's Ukrainian army units that are on the offensive. And so while the Russian strategic campaign against Ukrainian targets can continue, as in turn can the equivalent Ukrainian effort, at a battlefield level the two sides have now often switched roles, with Russian aviation being called on to break up Ukrainian offensives and attacks, while the Ukrainian flyers have to do what they can with what they've got. The problem, of course, is Ukraine doesn't have anything like the aircraft or air defense resources necessary to fully push the much larger Russian Air Force back from the forward edge of the battle area, and at the same time continues to face an ongoing threat from Russian long-range strike options. And so the Ukrainians have had every incentive to get especially creative in how they deal with the threat posed by the Russian Air Force. Which brings us nicely to Ukraine's recent campaign of sabotage and asymmetric counter-air operations. Because if you can't shoot them down, destroying them in their hangars also works. At the heart of the challenges that Ukraine faces in terms of the air and missile campaign is the simple reality that they're outnumbered by a more technologically sophisticated Russian opponent. So far at least, Ukraine just can't match the VKS airframe for airframe or missile for missile. If you're not willing to give up, that demands a certain degree of adaptability. They say necessity is the mother of innovation, and fighting a war of national survival is pretty high on the necessity spectrum. And so time and time again, we've seen the Ukrainians get creative in order to redress the balance in the air. You might look at a flying bathtub like the Tu-141 Strij and see a 6-ton reconnaissance drone from the 1970s. But the Ukrainians clearly saw some potential in the thing and converted them into cruise missiles to attack Russian air bases. Not exactly Caliber or Tomahawk, but it worked. S-200 air defense missiles that first entered service in the 1960s, well, to any other force, those might be obsolete systems ready for decommissioning. The Ukrainian military, meanwhile, doesn't have the luxury of waste, and so converted these things into ground attack systems, utilising them relatively recently in a number of attacks on Crimea and the Crimean Bridge. And then in some cases, the adaptation hasn't been technical at all, but rather tactical. And here, I'm particularly talking about a number of attempts to use surprise attacks to destroy Russian aircraft on the ground. Now, to be fair, the idea of just going over to your opponent's airfield and destroying all the aircraft there isn't a truly new one. An aircraft that's flying is generally fast, agile, and annoyingly difficult to hit. But even a 4th or 5th generation fighter that can thrust vector its way through all sorts of physics-defying maneuvers becomes considerably easier to hit when it's parked stationary on the ground. And so if you're going to try and destroy opposing aircraft, the ground is a pretty attractive place to do it. During World War II, for example, the British Special Air Service launched an attack at a German airfield in July 1942 during the North African Campaign. At its heart, the attack plan wasn't particularly complex. The British looked at the heavily defended German airfield and asked a question: what would happen if we just strapped a bunch of machine guns to some jeeps and charged it? The answer was that in a daring nighttime attack, the jeeps overran the perimeter defences of the airfield, and then proceeded to hoon up and down the runway like a group of particularly well-armed drag racers, firing incendiary tracer rounds into the parked aircraft as they did so, ultimately destroying 37 of them with a mixture of machine gun fire and planted explosives, before escaping and making the return to base with a grand total of 2 KIA. Now, as far as I'm aware, Ukraine hasn't yet tried to overrun any Russian airfields with a charge of MRAPs or anything, but they have demonstrated a few tricks all of their own. Throughout August, for example, there were a number of reported attacks on Russian airbases hosting strategic bombers. On the 19th of August, a Russian strategic airbase in the Novgorod region came under drone attack. What was interesting is that unlike previous attacks, which were usually undertaken by long-range Ukrainian drones, in this case the Russian Ministry of Defense and Russian state media claimed the attack had been done by copter-type drones. Those usually have much more limited ranges than fixed-wing drones, which suggests less a long-range drone attack from Ukrainian territory, and more a situation where Pavel and his mates are now driving a van around Novgorod with a pair of drones and some explosives in the back. In the immediate aftermath, the Ukrainians claimed to have hit 2 aircraft. Russian official media, meanwhile, claimed that 1 aircraft had been damaged and that all measures to eliminate the consequence of the attack had been completed. And if you're wondering what exactly a damaged Tu-22M looks like, here it is. As you can see, absolutely no aircraft destroyed, just a little bit of light superficial damage, and that with just a little bit of panel beating and maybe some new brake pads, she'll be right in no time. To be more serious for a moment, subsequently released satellite imagery helped confirm what that released image had already told us. That burned out black stain that you can see in the satellite image there is our lightly damaged Russian aircraft, while it appears that the rest of the resident strategic bombers have been evacuated to other bases. Presumably because if there might be active Ukrainians nearby with drones capable of dropping explosives, it's probably best not to keep the irreplaceable strategic bombers around. The fact that all the other aircraft have disappeared from that image suggests that if any others were damaged, it wasn't enough to prevent them getting airborne. Though I imagine under the circumstances, the ground crews would have been a little more permissive than normal about allowing aircraft to fly with minor damage or faults. Now, by itself, an attack like this, to be clear, doesn't really move the needle on the wider air war. But the way in which the attack might have been made still makes it very much notable. But if Russian reporting is accurate, noting it very much may well not be, then we're talking about a potentially very small-scale operation done by a small team using small and affordable drones, destroying a near irreplaceable strategic bomber, and forcing the rest to redeploy. In terms of cost efficiency, that's kind of like killing a tank with a shotgun. And it demands that every other Russian airbase out there take measures to prevent this same kind of thing happening again. meaning that one angry drone crew in their Scooby-Doo van may account for the efforts of hundreds or even thousands of security personnel that now have to stand guard duty all day watching the skies just in case the drones cometh. Like I said, it doesn't really move the strategic needle, but this is excellent economy of force. Over the course of August, there have been other reports of Ukrainian attacks against Russian airbases, usually employing different sorts of drones. But here, I'd sound a note of caution. I was happy talking about the previous attack because we had a combination of images from the event, satellite imagery, and corroborating reporting. In a number of these other cases, all we really have is competing Ukrainian and Russian claims. For example, there was a recently claimed attack against an airbase in Kursk, more than 170 kilometers behind the Russian border. And what highly advanced strike asset, you might ask, did the Ukrainians use to hit this no doubt highly defended target? Well, according to some of the reporting in the immediate aftermath, it was top-tier Australian technology. Namely, a number of Australian-designed one-way kamikaze drones literally made of cardboard. Because if you don't have a defence industrial base on the scale of that of China, the EU, or the United States, you can apparently always just weaponize arts and crafts class. Okay, so it may not be literal off-the-shelf cardboard, but close enough. If you get away from the strangeness of it for a moment, it actually makes a kind of sense. While the metal components like the warhead, fuel tank, or engine are going to have a radar signature, the cardboard bits and bobs are going to be pretty stealthy. Plus, as far as materials go, cardboard is usually going to be cheaper than aircraft-grade titanium. So all in all, it made for an attention-grabbing story. And this and other fixed-wing drone attacks fit perfectly into this section, because in at least some cases it is rumoured that launches are taking place from within Russian or Belarusian territory rather than from Ukraine itself, something which enables shorter-range systems to do their part for the war effort, though I imagine they also have the secondary effect of making Russian police and security forces very, suspicious of drone hobbyists. The only problem is that, at least as of time of recording, we just don't have the evidence to suggest that some sort of massive successful attack took place. What satellite imagery has come out since the claimed attacks doesn't really show any visible damage to the airbase or the aircraft there. That doesn't mean, of course, that no damage was done. We know, for example, that the Aussie drones in question are capable of airbursting above a target rather than directly impacting it, doing damage primarily with shrapnel and fragmentation. And while adding dozens of tiny holes to an airframe is usually not going to be great for its operational performance, it's also not the sort of damage that you'd expect to show up on a satellite image. But at the moment, we just don't have the evidence to demonstrate that any significant damage was actually done. Other subsequent attacks have yielded good visual evidence, however. On the 30th of August, Ukraine launched a number of drones again targeting Russian airbases and other similar installations. In terms of targeting, this campaign stretched from Pskov to Crimea, and in terms of scale, may be one of the largest drone attacks on Russia by Ukraine yet. We saw claims of a number of Russian aircraft damaged or destroyed, this time including Ilyushin 76 Condor transport aircraft. And critically, we got not just video and imagery of fires burning at the various targets, but also Russian state media coming out admitting that at least 4 aircraft had been hit, which I think should give us reasonable confidence that at least some of these valuable strategic airlifters were indeed damaged or destroyed. The general amount of damage being done in some of these strikes will probably take some time to clarify. It'll take even longer to be especially confident. But in the interim, I think there's 2 potentially relevant takeaways. The first is that the likely cost of these operations when compared to the damage being done and the effort involved in defending against them is pretty bloody insane. We've talked before about the economics of destroying a tank or an armoured vehicle using a cheap and affordable drone. But using cheap drones to kill things like strategic bombers might be the best trade deal in the history of trade deals. It's the kind of economy of force Ukraine is going to need if it's going to overcome its resource disadvantage relative to the Russians. But it's also something I think other nations should be watching very closely. Threats to parked aircraft aren't new. The previous version of something like the quad-rotor drone attack might be a small crew moving a mortar into position and then shelling an airbase quickly before running. But compared to something like a mortar, the drone option is likely to be more accurate, potentially more accessible, potentially harder to defend against, and also potentially less likely to get the crew killed in the process. After all, something like counter-battery radar is going to be able to hone in on a mortar round and feed that location to defending units. Depending on the drone in question and its flight path, however, defenders probably aren't going to have that sort of luxury. But those aren't the only unusual techniques we've seen Ukraine employ against Russian air power. Do you know what's easier than destroying an airframe on a runway? getting that airframe to come to you and change sides. We recently saw this when the Ukrainian intelligence services appear to have convinced a Russian helicopter pilot to fly his helicopter into Ukrainian territory and surrender it, along with its cargo, to the Ukrainians. It's reported the Ukrainians got the family of the pilot in question out of Russia beforehand to prevent reprisals, although apparently the other members of the helicopter crew weren't in on the plan. Now, one case of Grand Theft Mi-8 is not going to change the war, but it's probably a relatively low-cost way to get yourself a free helicopter. It certainly makes for excellent international publicity, and you can imagine it might also plant the idea in other Russian pilots that perhaps, just perhaps, this sort of thing is possible. And it also leads into something of a wider observation here, and that's the extensive involvement of Ukrainian military intelligence in the counter-air effort. Many of the longer-range drones and missiles in Ukraine appear to be under the control of regular military units. But in the case of things like short-range drone attacks launched from within Russia or the helicopter defection, well, there we've seen more claims of responsibility on the military intelligence side, suggesting those groups might be making a direct contribution to this overall effort. That probably sounds like a really obvious thing to do. The Ukrainians hate being bombed, so they're willing to target all the resources they have at stopping the bombers. But if history teaches us anything, it's that sort of whole-of-force approach shouldn't be taken for granted. I'll close this section with one other tentative observation and the associated questions. Namely, given how valuable Ukraine's remaining aircraft and airbases are, why haven't we seen a Russian equivalent to the sort of attack the Ukrainians launched on that Tu-22M? The Russians must know parked aircraft are vulnerable, and yet no boom. Here there's a lot of potential explanations, but precious little evidence to suggest which, if any of them, are relevant. It could be that Russia simply isn't prioritizing these sort of sabotage missions. It could be that they just don't have the capacity or capability to undertake these sort of missions, perhaps because the relevant special forces units are already overtasked or suffered heavy casualties in the earlier stages of the war. Maybe it's because they'd rather use these units simply to gather target information for cruise missile strikes rather than attempting direct actions. Or it could just be that Russian operatives find it particularly difficult to find local supporters in Ukraine that are willing to assist with their operations. If there was a massive Russian fifth column in Ukraine, I'd expect more smoking accidents and sabotage missions. But for now at least, that seems to be mostly a Russian phenomenon. But on that note, we will get back to a core component of the air war, namely the dueling campaigns of long-range missile and drone strikes being launched by both sides. The Russian long-range strike campaign has been a feature of their war planning since February 2022. We've talked about those early days before, so I won't rehash them much here. Instead, I want to focus on the observation that while the Russian long-range strike campaign bears some similarity to equivalent Western campaigns we've seen since the end of the Cold War, things like cruise missile strikes on opposing air defences or airfields, for example, so far it's evolved in a very different way. In most Western campaigns, Iraq stands out as an obvious example. Long-range standoff munitions, like cruise missiles and also to an extent stealth aircraft, have been most heavily used in the opening stages of a campaign. After all, that's when opposing defences should be at their most dangerous. These systems are used to safely take apart the infrastructure and assets an enemy needs to successfully defend itself. And then as the air defence system starts to break down, you then start to see other systems begin to come into play. If the opening stages of the 91 air campaign featured a lot of cruise missiles, by the end you had various ground attack aircraft like the A-10s, the F-15s or the F-111s flying around basically plinking Iraqi tanks at will. By contrast, however, we've sort of seen the Russian campaign evolve almost in reverse, with the attack bombers and helicopters flying attack missions well inside Ukrainian territory in February and March 2022, only to become more cautious over time and increasingly be replaced by long-range kamikaze drones and cruise missiles. Now almost all serious Russian strikes behind Ukrainian lines are being done with standoff munitions, and we've seen both the intensity and the makeup of those assaults change over time. Because not only have Russian missile strikes generally been launched with less frequency and intensity in most of 2023 than in the peak stages of 2022, those strikes are also relying more and more on cheap drones like Shahed 136 and less on expensive cruise missiles. What you see on screen here is Ukrainian data compiled by the CSIS on the makeup of individual Russian strikes in parts of 2023. Here we have to rely on Ukrainian data because the Russians don't publish fulsome strike composition information, which I think we can all agree is deeply inconsiderate of them. Between January and March 2023, about 40% of incoming long-range munitions were Shahed 136 drones or similar. Approximately 27% were relatively standard air-launched cruise missiles, and 12% were navally launched Caliber missiles. The remainder were a grab bag of adapted air defense missiles, hypersonics, and fossils left over from the Soviet era. Notably, all of this already represented a significant change from most of 2022. Remembering that in the earlier stages of the full-scale invasion, Russia was relying very heavily on systems like the Iskander ballistic missile, and wasn't really using things like the 136 at any appreciable scale. Cut to the April-June period, however, and drones now make up almost 60% of the incoming. Air-launched cruise missiles remain highly relevant, but there has been a significant observed drop-off in the use of both adapted anti-aircraft interceptors and also navally launched missiles. While it pretty much comes down to speculation, one has to imagine that with the uptick of long-range Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian territory, more Russian air defense systems will be busy doing, air defense work. While at sea, the Russian Black Sea Fleet isn't having the greatest time, facing constant harassment by Ukrainian unmanned sea drones, and now having to enforce an increasingly leaky blockade of civilian vessels trying to reach Ukrainian ports. And with that drop-off in more conventional missile strikes, it's been the drones that have been picking up some of the slack. While it's comparatively simple to assess scale and composition from the outside looking in, understanding what the Russians are trying to do with their strike campaign is always going to be more complicated. Monthly campaign objectives don't exactly get published in the papers, and I doubt anyone listening is privy to Russian command staff discussions. But the one method we do have available to us to try and gauge intent is to look at Russian targeting decisions. Basically, you look at what they're trying to destroy, and from that, backward engineer what their objectives might be. Here too, there are obviously caveats. You rely on the Ukrainians to release data as to missile hits and impacts. And significantly, you don't have good data on where intercepted incoming missiles were destined to strike if they had hit their targets. That's important because all else being equal, you'd expect the most strategically significant targets to, all else being equal, have the best air defences. Kyiv itself, for example, probably has some of the best air defences in the world by this point. And so if you just look at what targets are successfully struck without asking what targets were successfully defended, you may end up concluding that a lot of second or third priority targets were in fact the main campaign objective. But with those caveats in place, I think we can generally split Russian targeting into 4 distinct categories. Attacks on grain storage and export facilities, attacks on Ukrainian industrial targets, strikes aimed at Ukrainian Air Force or air defense targets, and finally those strike missions that end up hitting targets with no appreciable military or industrial value, even if their destruction often does carry with it a significant human cost. Since the collapse of the grain deal, we have seen a continuing pattern of Russian strikes on grain storage and export facilities, particularly hitting targets in Odessa and also ports on the Danube route. These have been coupled with some efforts by the Russian Navy to stop and search vessels heading towards Ukraine, all with the apparent objective of throttling Ukrainian shipping without the protections provided by the grain deal. A recent attack in the Odessa region, for example, is reported to have destroyed approximately 13,000 tons of stored grain originally destined for Egypt and Romania. In strategic military terms, these strikes remain something of a mystery. Russian PGM stocks are limited, the pool of available military targets is massive, and yet a decision is being made to prioritise valuable ordnance against relatively low-cost foodstuffs that aren't even meant to feed the Ukrainian people themselves. Now yes, these attacks do probably force the Ukrainians to stretch their ground-based air defences to cover more targets, but there's also an awful lot of industrial or military targets the Russians could be hitting if they wanted to stretch the Ukrainian air defences further. Couple that with the international political cost of very publicly attacking food exports, and I'd suggest it's hard to see the strategic logic in what Russia is trying to do here, unless perhaps, for example, they feel they can manipulate global support by threatening global food prices. If true, that's not going particularly well considering global wheat prices are down by between 20 and 25% from their July peak. But for the moment, there's no sign of these attacks stopping. And so we probably haven't seen the last of a major military power using expensive long-range precision-guided munitions to destroy agricultural products that are priced by the ton. The second apparent target set has been the Ukrainian Air Force and the air defense system itself. Applying a little bit of that American scissors beats rock mentality of applying air power to destroy anti-air power, we've seen a number of massed drone-missile combination attacks on air defense installations at places like Kyiv. Shortly after the arrival of Patriot systems, for example, we even saw the deployment of the Kinzhal hypersonics. while efforts to hunt down the Ukrainian Air Force using cruise and ballistic missiles have continued unabated. Here, the military logic of making the strikes is pretty evident. The targets are valuable pieces of military infrastructure or equipment. With some exceptions, however, the results overall seem to have been disappointing. While the Russians claimed multiple destroyed Patriot systems in Kyiv, for example, the Ukrainians suggested that really only one launcher was slightly damaged. But putting the claims aside, the evidence is in what happened next. No evidence of destroyed systems, and the successful interception of a number of additional incoming strikes, apparently by Patriot, in the following days and weeks. If the Patriot battery there had been knocked out of action, what we would have expected to see were massive follow-up strikes on the Ukrainian capital to destroy other valuable military targets there. In the end, that's just not what we saw. Similarly, claims that massive numbers of Ukrainian aircraft were being destroyed on the ground have often been followed by those same aircraft flying combat missions. Something that you would expect aircraft which have been heavily damaged to have a great deal of difficulty doing. To be clear, these sort of strikes have had a number of successes. They've often taxed Ukrainian defensive efforts to the very limits, and we have seen visual confirmation of the Ukrainians losing a number of air defense systems. But overall, despite these strike efforts, the Ukrainian integrated air defense system still remains very much intact. The third category is defense industrial targets. Observers at the CSIS noted that industrial targets got a relatively low priority in the opening stages of the Russian strike campaign, but they've grown in importance over time. In turn, the Ukrainians have relied on two different defensive techniques in order to try and protect their domestic industry. The first, where possible, is to move production to areas with significant air defense systems, areas like Kyiv, or alternatively to conceal and disperse them. That obviously carries a cost in terms of production efficiency and economies of scale, but if you're only running comparatively small operations out of nondescript buildings in the middle of nowhere, then the chances that someone in the Russian command is going to be confident enough to task a cruise missile against your location is hopefully going to be comparatively slim. Here, however, I've got to add two quick personal observations. The first is that dispersing and concealing your production sites doesn't work if the people involved make loud posts on social media about how great their hidden or dispersed production facility is. If you happen to get a bit too active on social media or give one too many interviews, there's always the chance the VKS will interpret that as a public invitation. The second element, however, is that this aspect of the Russian strike campaign suffers the same drawback it has since the beginning, namely that a majority of Ukraine's defense industrial potential isn't located in Ukraine, and that as long as a majority of the country's war material is coming in from allied nations as opposed to being produced domestically, there's an upper limit on what even the largest and most successful strike campaign possible can potentially accomplish. If you want to take out the F-16 plant, for example, that's in South Carolina, and while there may be divisions in the US political sphere over how to handle the war in Ukraine, I don't imagine there'd be much division on how to handle a missile attack on Greenville, SC. The final target set I mentioned are those with no apparent economic or military value at all. Think apartment buildings or civilian structures that haven't been adapted for government or military use. The reasons for these strikes are hard to assess. They could represent almost anything from misses to intelligence failures to technical error or simple acts of terror. What I think we can say, however, is that while these strikes will often show up as non-intercepts for the Ukrainian air defense system, while each of these hits may represent a significant human tragedy, they're probably exceptionally unlikely to move the needle on the wider military struggle. The flip side to this strike campaign is the Ukrainian air defense effort, and while there were some fears expressed in early 2023 about Ukraine potentially running out of anti-aircraft missiles, as best as we can tell, the Ukrainian air defense system appears to have largely held together, in no small part likely due to a surge in air defense interceptors and missile systems delivered from the West. As you can see on screen there, the Ukrainian claimed interception rates of Russian incoming are among the highest they've ever been, with the obvious caveats being that those are based on Ukrainian claims, and that secondly, you see significant local variation. Ukraine only has a limited number of systems capable of shooting down incoming ballistic or hypersonic missiles, for example. That's basically work for Patriot and SAMP-T. But Ukraine's limited supply of those systems can't be everywhere at once. And so when we see those sort of hard-to-intercept threats targeted against areas that don't have that kind of protection, often you'll see the claimed interception rates drop off significantly, even to zero. It is an undeniable reality that missiles and drones are still getting through. And when they do, it often hurts. Which brings us to two final questions on the Russian long-range strike campaign so far. What has it achieved? And is it sustainable? On that first point, I'd probably echo the statements made by the CSIS in their report on the Russian missile campaign. They conclude that the Russian long-range strike campaign has succeeded in hurting Ukraine and inflicting damage. It's also forced significant diversions of resources towards Ukrainian air defence. Allied military aid, for example, that could have been directed to building up the capabilities of the Ukrainian ground forces, have instead often been focused on trying to find Ukraine an ever greater supply of anti-air missiles. But at the same time, the Russian campaign hasn't succeeded in doing any sort of strategically decisive damage. The Ukrainian Air Force, the Ukrainian air defences, Ukrainian industry, all of these continue to operate. And that's despite the significant expense of the Russian campaign, not just in terms of ordnance, but in terms of aircraft hours, opportunity cost, and the demands on military manpower. The CSIS posit 4 main reasons for the apparent shortcomings of the Russian campaign so far. 2 of those reasons relate to the Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainians have been very good at dispersing and constantly moving their resources to frustrate targeting, and have also proven to be very capable when it comes to air defence work. The other 2 focus on the Russian side of the equation, suggesting that the Russians just haven't been able to generate enough attacks to hit the sheer number of targets they need to, and that when they have been able to generate strikes, technical and tactical factors may have undermined their effectiveness. There are 2 quick personal observations I'll add there. The first is that while some of those factors relate to things the Russians couldn't possibly have controlled, like the Ukrainian response, there are other factors here that were squarely within their control. And to me, the big one was targeting. Russia has a significant but limited ability to generate long-range strikes. And over the course of the war, it has chosen to disperse those strikes against a wide variety of targets, ranging from grain terminals to power infrastructure to airfields to air defence systems, etc. The result seems to be that all of those target sets have taken some damage, but none have taken decisive damage. Going back to the lessons learned from bombing efforts during the Second World War, for example, one has to wonder whether the Russians would have achieved better results in strategic terms if they'd been more focused in which target set they chose to go after. The second component is how sustainable this Russian effort might be. There was a lot of discussion early on in the war about how quickly Russia was depleting its stocks of long-range missiles, that Russia would arguably reach a point where its strikes would be limited by the rate of new missile production. And there is some evidence to suggest that now, here in 2023, that sort of supply constraint is increasingly a factor. There have been plenty of reports of people recovering components from Russian missiles and discovering that they were likely manufactured only weeks or months before. We've also seen increased reliance on drones at the expense of more valuable cruise missiles. But while that might be good news for Ukraine, I think there's also reason to give a couple of warnings. The first is, and I'll expand on this more in a future episode, there's plenty of evidence that the Russians are taking industrial mobilization very seriously, and that there are serious plans to mass manufacture both drones and to expand missile production in a major way. In that sense, the tempo of strikes that Russia can sustain may begin increasing over time. And some reporting also suggests that Russia may be attempting to rebuild something of a stockpile ahead of a new winter missile campaign, putting aside a stockpile of newly manufactured drones and cruise missiles, available for use in case of emergency, or for example in a renewed campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure come winter. The Ukrainians themselves recently claimed, for example, that Russia has increased planned production of Iskander missiles several times over, and has increased their overall stockpile of relevant missiles in recent months. Russia probably has burned through an awful lot of its pre-war missile stock, but as long as sanction busting continues, the money is there and the factories keep operating, Ukraine will have to be prepared for an enduring and sustainable Russian missile threat. Of course, Russia will probably have to repair itself as well, because while the Russian long-range strike campaign continues, there's every indication the Ukrainians intend to continue returning the favour. Which brings us to Ukraine's own escalating long-range strike campaign. Lacking the kind of specialised systems or resources that the Russians have, the Ukrainians have had to make do with what they've got. That's meant a comparatively more focused long-range strike campaign, hitting a smaller selection of targets over a wider geographical dispersion, while using the Wish.com or Alibaba version of a long-range strike arsenal, in the latter case sometimes literally. As far as we can assess, the objectives seem to have been to degrade Russian military capabilities, in particular by undermining logistics and also threatening Russian long-range strike capabilities, to stretch Russian air defense resources, and to send a political message both at home and abroad by engaging in highly visible strikes against high-profile targets in major Russian cities. Nothing undermines the narrative of everything is going well in the special military operation, quite like drones impacting MOD buildings in Moscow. Some of the most damaging Ukrainian strikes are being carried out using British and French cruise missiles, the Storm Shadows and Scalps. These strikes have destroyed barracks, headquarters, repair facilities and bridges, and have sometimes caused significant verifiable damage. The problem, however, is in scaling. At an upper-end estimate, Ukraine will only receive a couple of hundred of these missiles, which means when compared to the thousands of potential targets that could be struck, there's just never going to be enough Storm to strike everything in their potential shadow. Part of the solution the Ukrainians seem to have come up with is, much like the Russians, to try and integrate high-end and low-end options when it comes to long-range strike. The campaign against Crimea is probably a good example here. Over the course of August, we've seen small and large-scale drone swarm attacks, attacks by adapted ballistic missiles, raids by special forces personnel, attacks by boats firing long-range missiles, and other systems, with the targets often being things like radars and air defense installations. We even saw 2 S-400 launchers be destroyed. And then, in situations where highly valuable targets may be exposed and potential gaps in air defenses identified, the valuable missiles then being fired to destroy targets like headquarters or the bridges linking the peninsula to the mainland. It may be that Ukraine's cruise missile stocks are so valuable and limited that they don't want to take any unnecessary risk of the missiles being intercepted, instead trying first to stretch or degrade Russian defenses to maximise the odds of a good hit. The drone attacks deep inside Russia, meanwhile, have continued, although in recent days and weeks we've seen comparatively fewer long-range strikes against Russian cities, and more against targets like airfields and factories nearby. The weapons of choice here so far seem to be Ukrainian drones like the Beaver, which, while you could probably argue are pretty pricey compared to their payload, do have the range to make this sort of trip. While it's only speculation at this point, the constant changing of the targets of these attacks might be part of the strategy in and of itself. Attacks on cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg might force the redeployment of air defense assets, only for the targeting to then switch to airfields that might be hundreds of kilometers away from either city. Russia, compared to just about every other nation on Earth, has a lot of air defenses. But there's also just a lot of Russia, which runs the risk of air defenses becoming a too small blanket, constantly being pulled to different areas of the homeland. As the range of Ukrainian drones increases, protecting one area of the country might mean uncovering another one. And because of how cheap these drones are relative to the value of these targets, both politically and in monetary terms, it makes sense for Ukraine to continue scaling these up, putting new areas under threat, and putting ever more pressure on a limited supply of Russian radars, launchers, and interceptors. Traditionally, a Russian answer to this sort of wide-area air defense might be to use manned interceptor aircraft or long-range strategic SAMs, things like the S-300 or S-400. But if you're shooting down a drone that Pavel threw together in his garage using a ripple-fired S-400, then you're probably hoping for oil to reach $250 a barrel in the near future. Unless Ukraine is able to massively scale up these kind of attacks or introduce much more capable systems in large numbers, these strikes probably aren't going to do any sort of massive damage to the Russian economy. But what they can do is annoy the shit out of the Russians, force them to redeploy air defenses across European Russia, and divert valuable air defense resources towards protecting strategic targets or avoiding political embarrassment, as opposed to, for example, fortifying critical terrain like Crimea. If you want some evidence that pressure may be playing out, then, for example, there was some recent reporting suggesting that some S-300 units, previously stationed in the Far East and proximate to Japan, may now have been withdrawn. So in aggregate, the Ukrainian strike campaign has probably done less physical damage to Russia than Russia's campaign has done to Ukraine. There haven't been, for example, any direct Ukrainian equivalents to Russia's massive attacks against Ukraine's power infrastructure over the winter. But what the campaign probably does deliver is serious value for money, both in military and political terms. Militarily, by giving Ukraine the ability to turn its intelligence and targeting advantage into destroyed headquarters, munitions depots, or logistical links, and politically by forcing Russia to deal with a war much closer to home. The problem Ukraine faces, however, is probably that of scale and sustainability. But I think it's important to say that when you talk about the trend of Ukrainian long-range attacks, well, we may well not have seen anything yet. Barring some massive disrupting event like Ukraine being totally cut off from access to drone components, for example, I think it's far more likely that the rate of production of drones in Ukraine increases over time rather than decreases. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about 1 or 2 Alibaba drones being launched against an individual oil refinery. Now we're increasingly talking about massed attacks being launched at multiple targets simultaneously using largely purpose-developed systems. And to support that ever-improving and expanding family of drones, Ukraine vitally has a small number of Western-supplied air-launched cruise missiles, and also probably, based on recent Ukrainian reporting, a small number of indigenously built long-range Ukrainian systems. For now at least, most likely in the form of Neptune anti-shipping missiles, adapted for long-range ground attack. Both Ukraine's drone arm and indigenous missile fleet are likely to pose increasing challenges to Russia over time, but they're only likely to have their maximum potential impact if Ukraine's other air and missile capabilities aren't worn away. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, a partial answer may be on the way, with the announcement, recently made, that after almost 17 months of persistent requests, Ukraine would, we are now sure, be getting the F-16 jets it had long asked for. And at time of recording, 17 months isn't really an exaggeration. There's coverage of Ukraine asking for Western 4th generation fighters, including the F-16 specifically, going back as far as March 2022. But the imperative for these aircraft has only grown over time, as the Ukrainians face an increasingly pressing need to replace lost airframes and build desperately needed capabilities. I think the unfortunate but honest reality is that while the Ukrainian army has proven itself more and more a match for its Russian opponent over time, the Ukrainian Air Force, incredibly badly outnumbered and out-teched by the VKS, has been dangerously attrited and worn down by 18 months of a continuous operation. Visually confirmed losses have been high, at least 71 fixed-wing aircraft, while the number of replacements received is probably closer to 45. And that's not counting the constant strain on airframes and pilots from constantly moving between airstrips, flying dispersed operations against a much more powerful opponent. That sort of almost guerrilla operation is going to take a toll on airframes, it's going to take a toll on maintenance personnel, and in some cases it may even contribute to some painful accidents. The Ukrainian army may be able to sustain its ongoing battle of attrition, but over the long term, without additional aircraft, the Ukrainian Air Force can't. If you want an understanding of how dangerous this sort of attrition might be, let's have a quick case study looking at the Sukhoi 24 fleet. The Sukhoi 24, NATO reporting name Fencer, is, like many aircraft in current Russian or Ukrainian service, an old Soviet design at heart. The very first models rolled off the production line in the 1960s, giving the Soviets what at the time was a very fast, very capable attack bomber. The aircraft have since been modernised and gone through service life extension programs, and continue to be used by various countries for both attack and reconnaissance missions. Now, if you were looking for reasons to criticise the Fencer, you'd be able to find a lot of legitimate reasons. For one, the aircraft seems purpose-designed to physically torture those responsible for maintaining it. For example, like the American F-111 or F-14 Tomcat, this is a variable geometry design. This is a feature everyone thought was really cool in the 1960s, basically allowing the aircraft to swing its wings forward or backwards, to change the physical shape of the aircraft as required. Like the F-14 and F-111, this meant the Sukhoi 24 could optimize itself for both low-speed flying, like takeoff and landing, but also for high-speed supersonic operation. Unfortunately, however, when you introduce enough moving parts to enable you to move the wings while the plane is flying, the result is more than a little additional maintenance overhead. Add to that the fact that the production line closed in the 90s, meaning the youngest Fencer airframes in existence are at the very least millennials, and you can probably understand why it might be a pain for Ukraine to keep something like this flying. So much so that at the beginning of the war, Ukraine's reported to only have had approximately 23 of these aircraft in active service, including both the attack bomber and reconnaissance versions. Since February 2022, 17 of those have been visually confirmed destroyed. Others may have been reactivated from airframes Ukraine had in deep storage. Ukraine had quite a number of these, and some have even been attacked by the Russians. But at the same time, you have to imagine there's been significant wear and tear operating an airframe like this one under wartime conditions. If Ukraine wants more, well, that's too bad, because there aren't really any real sources of potential replacements out there. The aircraft is mostly flown by nations like Russia, Belarus, and Syria, which aren't exactly going to donate their examples, and NATO countries have a grand total of 0. And yet, this decades-old maintenance hog is absolutely vital to the current Ukrainian war effort. because so far it is the only aircraft in the Ukrainian inventory known to be capable of carrying and firing the Storm Shadow and Scalp air-launched cruise missiles. Without that handful of remaining operational airframes, Ukraine currently has no way to launch those devastating long-range strikes that have targeted Russian logistics, command posts, and bridges. The Russians obviously know this and have hunted the aircraft relentlessly. In a sense, the Ukrainian fences have become a sort of white rhino of the Ukrainian Air Force, the last few remaining examples of an endangered species, ruthlessly hunted by Russian missile strikes against their air bases, all in an apparent attempt to render these ancient airframes extinct. For now, the last remaining fences keep flying. We know that because the Storm Shadows and Scalps do. But if eventually the Russians get their way, and either enemy action or simple wear and tear takes these airframes out of service, then Ukraine is going to desperately need something else, anything else, that can fill that vital role of carrying and launching Western cruise missiles. That's really part of where F-16 comes in. After more than a year of purely theoretical discussion, the supply of F-16 airframes to Ukraine became very real in August. 3 nations came out and said that they would be donating airframes: Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. Others, like the United States, announced that they would assist with training or support. Exact numbers are still being clarified. The Danes have tentatively indicated that they'll supply 19 airframes, with the first of them to arrive this year, hopefully. The Dutch haven't specified a definite figure as far as I've seen, but the Ukrainians seem hopeful that they might get all 42 that are currently in Dutch service. As for how many aircraft Norway or other potential donors will provide, only time will tell. But even just taken together, those announcements probably indicate 3 things. That Ukraine is likely to get a significant number of F-16 airframes relative to the size of its current air fleet, that the first of those airframes may indeed arrive in 2023, and that after the better part of 18 months relentlessly hunting the Ukrainian fencer fleet, there may well be a couple of depressed planners in the VKS realising that for all their efforts, the fencers are about to be significantly augmented by a Western 4th-generation design. We can also now talk more definitively about what type of F-16s Ukraine is likely to get. The F-16 is quite an old, very widely produced design, and so as a result, they're kind of like Barbies. There's a million different versions dressed up in different ways for different missions. And now that I potentially mark myself as a target for every Viper pilot out there, let's talk about what will soon be the Ukrainian version, the Midlife Update, or MLU. When compared to new production versions, it's roughly equivalent to the Block 50 or Block 52, meaning this isn't the most dangerous, most up-to-date F-16 ever produced, but it's also not bottom tier either, sort of middle of the pack. The MLU introduced a considerable radar upgrade which extended its detection range and ability to penetrate jamming, as well as additional radar modes and weapon integration options. All in all, this is a relatively capable multi-role 4th-generation platform. It is almost unambiguously a significant upgrade over, for example, many of the MiG-29s that Ukraine is currently flying. What it isn't, however, is some sort of superweapon. And as a fighter aircraft specifically, it still probably falls short of the best the Russians have to offer. And if given the choice, I wouldn't want to take an F-16 MLU Block 20 up against, say, for example, the Sukhoi 35. In large part, that's just because I'm not a trained fighter pilot, but hopefully you get the point. While this aircraft certainly makes the playing field more equal for Ukrainian pilots, it doesn't equalise the overall technology gap. But since the F-35 or F-15EX weren't exactly on offer, it looks like F-16 is what the Ukrainians are going to make do with for now. The announcement of F-16 deliveries is a big win for Ukraine, but probably not the end of their ambitions to rebuild the Ukrainian Air Force. For example, we recently saw Zelensky visit Sweden, and there he reiterated his country's long-standing request for JAS-39 fighters, the famous Gripen. I don't need to revisit the value that even early model Gripens would bring to the Ukrainian Air Force. The aircraft is basically perfectly designed and adapted for exactly the sort of fight Ukraine is now in. But so far at least, Sweden hasn't made any concrete moves on actually supplying them. That said, Zelensky recently said that Ukrainian pilots are training on the type, so if nothing else, it signals that even though Ukraine may be getting its F-16s, it definitely hasn't given up on other potential airframes, especially ones that might have access to a suite of interesting European weapon systems that don't have existing integration options with F-16, namely things like the I-win button of aerial combat, commonly known as the Meteor missile. For me, however, the big question that will help impact just how significant the F-16 announcement is what sort of missiles and ordnance the Ukrainians are getting to go with them. By themselves, the F-16s do provide replacements to the Ukrainian Air Force to enable them to continue to fly, despite losses among the MiG-29 or Sukhoi-27 fleet. But with the right missile and ordnance options, they could potentially become something special. Firstly, we don't know what sort of air-to-air missiles the Ukrainians are going to be getting. The AIM-120 AMRAAM is the obvious choice, but that missile comes in lots of different versions, ranging from the old and still dangerous, to the AIM-120D versions with their massively increased flight range, improved guidance system, and a variety of other features that have a potential to turn aerial combat into a game of picking a track that you would like to not be there anymore. Given the altitude advantage of Russian combat air patrols and the impressive range and performance of the most modern Russian air-to-air missiles, the better missiles Ukraine gets, the less uneven the overall fight is likely to be. Then there's the question of bombs and standoff munitions. After all, the F-16 is a true multi-role aircraft, and we should expect the Ukrainians to use it significantly in its ground attack role. That might include allowing the Ukrainians to get the best out of existing munitions like the AGM-88 HARM, to better deliver systems like JDAM, or to potentially deliver a new suite of long-range munitions. One the Ukrainian Defense Minister has already talked about is the creme de la creme, the AGM-158 Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile. Basically America's long-range equivalent to the Franco-British Scalp or Storm Shadow, the AGM-158 has the potential to take a 400-plus kilo warhead and deliver it precisely in a low-profile package hundreds of kilometres away. At a stroke, that would provide Ukraine with a massive augmentation to its existing Su-24 Storm Shadow combo. Unlike Storm Shadow, this is a missile which is in current high-rate production, is available in significant inventory numbers, and which would pose a very significant challenge for Russian air defences. The American defence industrial base may not have been prepared for an all-out artillery war in Europe, but it is decently well optimised to support an air force that specialises in yeeting things at enemy forces from long distance. The obvious challenges, of course, are likely to be political. America has been relatively cautious compared to some other NATO allies to supply advanced long-range systems, and it is the United States and the US alone that holds the key to weapon systems like this one. At the same time, we've also seen a lot of discussion in the press about potential European options to augment Ukraine's supply of air-launched cruise missiles. In particular, debate very publicly continues over the supply of the German-built KEPD Taurus. For me, the Taurus represents a significant capability if Ukraine got to the point of actually fielding it, but there are a few factors that probably make it a bit of a distraction when compared to potential American designs. For one, the number of systems available just isn't that high compared to American ones. The German Air Force only bought 600 of these missiles in total, which is below America's annual production target for AGM-158. The second problem, of course, is that the missile isn't currently integrated with either Sukhoi-24 or the F-16, meaning that either an adapter would have to be designed to allow the missile to be fired from something Ukraine has in service, or Ukraine would have to be given an airframe that's capable of supporting this missile, something like Tornado. I've talked a lot in recent months about the Europeanization of aid to Ukraine, and to be clear, there are some European options that might be helpful to support the Ukrainian F-16 fleet. Turkey, for example, has an ALCM that is known to be F-16 compatible. But if Ukraine wants to get the most possible out of its F-16s, either in the air-to-air or air-to-ground role, then ultimately the clearance and the weapon systems are probably going to have to come from Washington. Along with the question of missiles and ordnance, there's also the question of pilots and ground crews. This is a barrier that was often cited by those who wanted to put the supply of Western fourth-generation aircraft into the too hard basket when it came to Ukraine aid. And to be fair, there are going to be some very significant hurdles that now have to be jumped over. Aircraft like the F-16 need a trained pilot to perform to their maximum potential in combat conditions, and a ground crew that understands what it takes to get this sometimes picky aircraft flying. The easiest way forward is going to be to convert existing experienced Ukrainian combat pilots over to the F-16 platform. That's going to be easiest for pilots who both speak fluent English and also have combat experience. And from what's been reported, some of that training is already taking place. But here, Ukraine does face a number of challenges. For one, its existing pool of experienced pilots has been taking attrition as they fight, waiting for these new aircraft to arrive. Just recently, for example, a training accident killed 3 Ukrainian pilots, including the somewhat famous Andriy, many of you will know him by his call sign Juice, who was an English-speaking Ukrainian pilot known for his advocacy for F-16 deliveries, but who will now never see them delivered and flying. Ukraine is going to have to make the hard call between keeping its pilots active in service and fighting, or pulling them off the line to either train others or to do conversion training themselves onto Western platforms like F-16. We did get a small clue as to how Ukraine might be dealing with this training issue recently. It's reported that a Ukrainian Air Force representative said that pilots that were being sent to Denmark to train on F-16 would be finishing their courses in something like 4 to 6 months, while those going to the UK were in for a course lasting between 1 and 2 years. The difference seems to be that the pilots going to Denmark are going to be experienced combat pilots who know how to fly and fight. They just need to know how to fly and fight the F-16. The pilots going to the UK, however, are likely to be the next generation. Recent flight school graduates who have a lot more to learn, but who aren't as desperately needed at the front. This training dilemma for pilots and ground crews is part of the reason why some Western commentators have talked about how long it might take Ukraine to reach full capability with its F-16s. That's probably very true, although it may miss a point in the short term. And that is that even a limited operating capability might deliver Ukraine something valuable. Even a Ukrainian pilot who isn't ready to take his F-16 into air-to-air combat against a Russian Sukhoi 35 might be fully capable of taking the aircraft to altitude and then pickling off a couple of cruise missiles. And given the importance of those strikes in targeting Russian HQs, ammunition stockpiles, logistic links, etc., even that might be a significant boost for Ukrainian efforts. So where does that leave the F-16 announcement in terms of total overall impact? As far as I can assess, the F-16 is unlikely to be a wonder weapon. Its arrival is unlikely to suddenly transform the conditions at the front, send the Russians fleeing back towards the Sea of Azov, or overcome the significant advantage the VKS has in aircraft and technology. But what it will probably do is still extremely important, because first and foremost it will keep the Ukrainian Air Force flying. It will provide desperately needed replacements for airframes that are being destroyed or being worn out. It will help narrow the technological gap that currently exists between Ukrainian pilots and their opponent. And as long as it is provided along with the right weapons systems, it may also provide Ukraine with a desperately needed alternative for the endangered Fencer fleet in its vital role delivering long-range cruise missile strikes. It may be in the end that the war doesn't change that much when F-16s start arriving, but it may change the situation significantly when compared to a world in which it never arrived at all, and where after years of difficult fighting, the Ukrainian Air Force finally began to lose its ability to carry out its essential missions. For Russia, running Ukraine out of Sukhoi 24s may have been possible. Running the West out of F-16s, however, good bloody luck. The final aspect of the air war I want to talk about today is frontline or tactical aviation. For many armies around the world, this is the job that air forces exist to do. And for many air forces, this is the job they have to do to stop the army complaining and trying to steal their budget. It's an absolutely vital part of the air campaign, but seeing as we'll likely revisit it when we talk about the Ukrainian offensive again in the future, I will try to be comparatively brief. The first thing to say about battlefield aviation in Ukraine is that if you're looking at it through the lens of Western doctrine and thinking, the situation is very strange. For many NATO forces, gaining air superiority over the battlefield would probably be a prerequisite for any major offensive action on the ground. If you look at American or NATO operations since the end of the Cold War, often the first step is for the Air Force to disassemble the opposing air defense system, destroy or ground their Air Force, and then to destroy the cohesion and combat potential of the opposing ground force. By the time coalition ground troops went into Iraq in 1991, much of the Iraqi military had already been pulverized or paralyzed by the coalition air effort. But here in Ukraine, not only is the airspace contested, but it is the side with fewer and less capable air assets, Ukraine, which is actually primarily on the offensive, trying to break apart prepared defensive positions without the benefit of having aircraft fly over to precisely destroy enemy logistics nodes or defensive positions. Air power still obviously has a role to play. It still obviously integrates into the fire planning on both sides. And there are probably few commanders out there, Russian or Ukrainian, that will say no to having a 2,000-pound JDAM or a 500-kilo Russian glide bomb pulverize one or two well-selected enemy positions at the appropriate juncture. But ultimately, on the Ukrainian battlefield, the air forces are serving as a supporting arm, as opposed to being the decisive one. Russian tactical aviation has, of course, played a significant role and is commonly complained about by Ukrainian sources. In particular, there are two forms of Russian tactical aviation that I want to quickly call out. The first is the use of Russian attack helicopters, particularly Ka-52s, as long-range ATGM platforms. This is a phenomenon we've described in the past. As the offensive has ground on, the Ka-52s have continued to show themselves deadly. We've continued to see more footage of ATGM attacks against Ukrainian vehicles, although it's not always clear if the vehicle was disabled before or after the missile hits. And at the same time, we've also seen mounting attrition on the Ka-52 fleet itself, with 41 visually confirmed lost since 2022. Depending on which source you read, that's between 1.25% of all Ka-MOV 52s that were operational in February 2022. Although the production of new aircraft and spare parts over the 18 months remains an open question. The duel between the Russian helicopters and the Ukrainian attackers is an important one. The Ka-MOVs enjoy a considerable range advantage with their ATGMs over most manpads or short-range air defences. When Ukrainian forces are attacking, they can safely sit behind Russian lines and engage them with their missile systems without much risk of return fire. However, the further back the Ukrainian positions are set, the further forward the helicopters have to go, and the greater the risk of running into a concealed manpad's position, for example, and potentially being shot down. But at the same time, if the Ukrainians keep their vehicles, like their tanks, too far back from the contact line, well, then it becomes much harder for those vehicles to do their job and support the attacking infantry. And so you end up with a risk calculus on both sides that has a passing resemblance to fencing. If you thrust forward, you may be able to land a hit, whether that's supporting your infantry or striking enemy vehicles. But by moving forward, you also leave yourself open. It's a dangerous game that's continued to see tactical adaptations on both sides. But it is one that, all else being equal, tends to favour the side on the defensive. Because whereas a defender can often remain concealed and dug in, on the attack the Ukrainians are often going to have to come out of their concealed positions and concentrate in order to move forward. Something which is dangerous enough in the face of Russian minefields and artillery forces, let alone the efforts of the Russian attack helicopters. By comparison, we see comparatively fewer complaints by Russian forces about Ukrainian helicopters, as well as getting less footage of Ukrainian helicopters doing direct damage. There are a lot of reasons that probably go into that, ranging from the fact that the Ukrainian helicopter fleet is just smaller to begin with, and doesn't have the same sort of standoff ATGM capabilities that the Ka-MOV does, as well as the fact that Ukrainian helicopters are often desperately needed for transport duties, for example, and that given Russia's enduring advantage in long-range missiles, glide bombs, etc., Ukrainian helicopter crews probably have to be pretty tactical about where they choose to set up their air bases. There's a personal observation here about rotary aviation potentially being a bit of a bully weapon on the battlefield. It works best when you have something really snazzy and top of the line and the opponent doesn't have much to shoot back with anymore. If you've got an Apache or a Ka-52 and your opponent doesn't have any coherent air defense left, then there are probably few weapons in the world that are better adapted at aggressively punching down. But in airspace that's still as heavily contested as that in Ukraine, the helicopter fleets on both sides still seem to be having something of a difficult time. The other side of battlefield aviation I wanted to quickly talk about was the increasing use of glide bombs. When we last talked about the air war in April, these were just starting to be introduced on the Russian side. Now they're fairly common features, bitterly complained about by many Ukrainian ground troops. Compared to conventional artillery, a glide bomb has an advantage of delivering a much larger payload. Compare a 40-kilogram shell, for example, to a 500-kilogram bomb. Meanwhile, compared to the sort of dumb bombs the Russians were using in large numbers at the beginning of their invasion, it has the advantage of range and precision. A Russian Sukhoi 34, for example, doesn't have to fly over Ukrainian air defences, and can instead safely release its payload from behind Russian lines. Ukrainian commentators talk about Russia using these weapons much as the Ukrainians themselves deploy JDAM. They try and target headquarters, ammunition depots, logistical nodes, or where their reconnaissance complex allows them to do so, also to hit troop concentrations or forward positions. There's been some online commentary that the Russian bombs don't match the American JDAM in terms of every technical performance characteristic. It's claimed, for example, that they're less accurate or more likely to break up and malfunction. But when talking about warfare at this sort of scale, I think that partially misses the point. They may be inherently less accurate, but Russia has a better ability to jam guidance systems than Ukraine does. And given the VKS advantage in the number of aircraft available, they can also deliver far more of these things than the Ukrainians can deliver JDAM. Ultimately, they do represent a key battlefield threat that the Ukrainians have to consider and prepare for, knowing full well that if they take a forward position, for example, from the Russians, there is always the chance that one or two of these will come flying in to try and destroy it. The Ukrainians, of course, try to respond in kind, but their biggest limitation is sortie rate. Recently, the Ukrainian Air Force claimed to have flown 14,000 sorties since 2022. About half of those reportedly were attack missions. If you want a comparison, on day one of Desert Storm, the coalition flew 2,775 sorties. Some of those being by strategic bombers, each capable of carrying potentially dozens of air-launched cruise missiles. The entire Ukrainian air effort from February 22 to now is only equivalent to less than a week of Allied operations at that scale, and this time against the Russian military, not the Iraqi one. That's not to say they don't do significant damage with the missions that they do fly. We've seen cases in Donetsk and also on the southern front, for example, of JDAMs being used to pulverize heavily fortified and defended Russian positions. Buildings that would be resistant to almost any number of 155mm shells can still be brought down by a 2,000-pound bomb, for example. The difference is, whereas you might see Russian aircraft being used regularly to try and attrit Ukrainian forces over time, more often we see Ukrainian aircraft being used in a very precise way to try and augment other efforts. That might mean MiG-29s carrying AGM-88s, for example, trying to open gaps in air defences to enable a large drone attack to go in. Or it might mean a couple of precisely chosen JDAM targets being hit, not just to cause Russian losses, but to enable a particular offensive action. One clue as to how valuable systems like JDAM might be to the Ukrainians is the fact that we've seen them integrate them with the Sukhoi 27, not just with the MiG-29. The 27s are currently Ukraine's most capable air-to-air platform. So if they're expending time, money and resources to adapt those platforms to drop bombs and then risking them on JDAM runs, then it probably suggests even though JDAM has had some mixed reviews in Ukraine, in part due to Russian GPS jamming, the Ukrainians see the value in these kinds of missions. I think the question then becomes whether Ukraine's allies will ultimately decide to provide it with something with just a little more reach than the JDAM ER. Something like the AGM-154 JSO, for example, wouldn't be that much more expensive while also extending the engagement range just that little bit further. Ultimately, I think the current assessment is that at the battlefield level, the Russian VKS has a significant advantage. It's operating on the defensive against Ukrainian ground forces that have to expose themselves. It has an advantage in technology, mass, and munitions, and it can integrate its operations as part of a wider defensive plan. The Ukrainians, by contrast, are trying to do something that, by Western standards, is highly unconventional. Launch a ground offensive into prepared enemy positions using an inferior air force. One might observe it's in this ground attack role, desperately needed, that Ukraine might be able to deploy its first F-16s long before they get sent on their first air superiority missions. Because while there are many fighter pilots out there who no doubt dream of the dogfight, sometimes what the war effort needs most is someone to truck more JDAMs to the front. So with those announcements made and all that said, what should we expect to see next from the long-range air and missile campaign in Ukraine? The first is to say the air defense systems on both sides are likely to hold together. Indeed, provided ammunition reloads and new systems continue to arrive as pledged, Ukraine's air defences might actually gain new capabilities over time. That means the basic nature of this air war, one of mutually contested airspace in which neither side can really launch deep penetration missions into opposing airspace, is likely to persist. Both are likely to continue to try and attrit, wear down or bypass opposing defences, but in the near term at least, new systems continue to arrive and the status quo is likely to persist. Point 2 is that both sides will probably continue to demonstrate strategic resilience, particularly when you're talking about things like industrial output. On the Russian side, the Ukrainian economy is just probably too big with too many targets to reliably hit with the limited resources available. While for the Ukrainians, a lot of the Russian economy is going to be entirely out of reach, either in terms of range or politically, with Ukraine's Western partners still restricting their ability to use Western-manufactured weapons against recognised Russian territory. What that means is that while strikes can have an impact and drive attrition, we're not likely to see them deliver decisive effects, which in turn puts the focus squarely back on the ground campaign. The announcement of F-16 is all about the long-term trend for the development of the Ukrainian Air Force. Without F-16, its long-term destiny was probably attrition and diminishing capability. With F-16s, however, the Ukrainians have a path towards actually building up their Air Force strength and integrating a range of new weapons and capabilities. While I don't see any sign of America gearing up to provide particularly valuable weapons like AIM-120D or AGM-158 in the near term, Getting F-16 online will clear the greatest hurdle to the introduction of those weapons, meaning that if and when the political winds shift, weapon suppliers can potentially quickly shift with them. How likely that is, however, we'll have to wait and see. In conclusion, the air campaign in Ukraine has taken on some of the same attritional characteristics as the ground war, and at both the battlefield and strategic level, that has given Russia an opportunity to leverage mass and technology in order to continue inflicting losses and damage on the Ukrainians. With the caveat, of course, that applying greater force requires expending greater resources, and that factors like dispersed Russian targeting and Ukrainian adaptability have prevented Russia dealing anything like strategically decisive damage despite 18 months of missile bombardment. By contrast, Ukraine continues to lean very heavily on asymmetric responses, using adapted technology, sabotage, or cheap drones to make up for comparative shortages in advanced weapon systems like air-launched cruise missiles. That sort of innovation has continued to allow Ukraine to punch well above its weight, and if drone production and weapon deliveries continue to ramp up, then it's likely to continue to do so. The key, however, is to remember that Ukrainian resources are not infinite, and that while drones are absolutely essential, Ukraine still has a desperate need for more conventional weapons like manned aircraft and air-launched cruise missiles. That requirement to deal with long-term attrition is part of why the announcement of F-16 was so significant. But if the Ukrainian Air Force is going to continue this struggle going forward, then whatever announcements do or don't come next about additional aircraft, missiles, or ordnance are probably going to be every bit as important. Alright, channel update to close out. And in the end, I'm somewhat happy this video got delayed a week, considering the fact that in the interim, we saw a number of minor developments in the air campaign, like a number of massed Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian airfields, and some significant Russian missile strikes fired back in response. The nature of this war is that it's always changing, and so there's never going to be a perfect time to do an update. But with the F-16 announcement finally being locked in, I thought now was the right time for this one. In terms of broader channel update stuff, firstly, thank you very much to all of you who watched the video last week. It seems to have been particularly well received, and that's always good to see. The other thing I wanted to say, because we had a sponsor today and I haven't provided a charity update in some time, is that as normal, I've been trying to keep up the pattern of giving to Ukraine-relevant charities on a fairly regular basis. Most recently, I've been trying to focus on those providing medical or humanitarian care, but I will be putting up a vote for patrons relatively soon to help get a sense of where the community think I should be directing my efforts in that regard. I'm very aware of the fact that what we talk about on this channel a lot of the time is a very real war, one which deeply impacts the lives of millions of people. It's very important to me as a result that we make at least some contribution to trying to offset that damage. And I'm always happy to take a little bit of a steer as to how to do it. As I said, I'll be providing a more comprehensive update for the patrons shortly, and a vote to go up along with it. With that said, thank you very much all of you for your support as always, and I do hope to see you all again next week.